So you're audible.
Okay.
So we can hear you, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Juhi, we can start.
Okay, thanks. So on behalf of the Adaptation Futures Secretariat, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the first pre-conference webinar of 2021 on governing adaptation with local actors and global networks. This webinar is being organized in partnership with the project Strengthening Non-State Climate Action in the Global South, being led by the African Center for Technology Studies in Kenya, the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University, the German Development Institute in Germany, and the Energy and Resources Institute in India. As you may know, after 2 postponements due to the pandemic, the new dates for AF 2020 have finally been announced from the 4th to the 8th of October 2021, later this year. Please do check our website and social media for further updates. We'd like to begin with some basic housekeeping announcements. As I can hear, I think, can everyone else please mute their microphones for the remainder while someone else is speaking, because we can keep hearing disturbances. Today's webinar is being recorded and it's also being streamed live on YouTube. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with colleagues. This webinar will run for 2 hours, and attendees are encouraged to post questions in the Q&A box at any point in time during the webinar. These will be addressed during the dedicated question and answer sessions. Please remember to post questions in the Q&A box only, because other questions in the chat box may be missed by the moderators. I would like to now call upon Dr. Manish Srivastava for introducing the webinar on behalf of the Climate South Project. He's an assistant professor at the Department of Energy and Environment at the TERI School of Advanced Studies in New Delhi, where he teaches governance of climate change and issues in global justice. The floor is yours. We can't hear you. I think you've muted yourself.
Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you, Juhi, and welcome everybody to this very interesting and exciting webinar, which focuses on the governance issues relating to adaptation, but with special attention to the role that local actors can play, but how they relate with the evolving international global networks. As we all know, that the role of subnational and non-state actors has been widely recognized in the global governance of climate change. But broadly, it is more focused on the mitigation, and the adaptation governance is slightly less explored, primarily for the reason that adaptation has been labeled as an issue with which is deeply determined by the local context and local actors. But this has been changing over the last couple of years, and particularly with the objective of, or the goal that the way the Paris Agreement has defined its goal, where a climate resilient future is in itself a goal, which is further enforced by the adoption of global adaptation goal. So the adaptation perspective in the global governance is becoming an important area of discussion. There are still many questions to be answered, many dimensions to be explored. In today's webinar, we focus on one important entry point, which is the availability of vast experiences, vast local experiences with adaptation and the role of non-state and subnational actors therein. The important thing for us is to see at this experience and figure out what can we learn from it and create a global governance architecture that can facilitate adaptation and resilience. And there is a global flow of not only knowledge sharing and experience sharing, but also of resources and capacities. So we focus on that in this webinar. We have a very interesting mix of speakers today. If I can use the term that it's a very intergenerational and intragenerational panel, which comprises people who are empirical researchers, policy advocates and policy influencers. They have also been very influential policymakers in their recent past. Not taking much of your time, let me just get on with the webinar, which is organized in two parts. The first part focuses on the empirical survey of discussions and experience on the role of non-state actors, subnational actors in adaptation and their networks. And the second part will deliberate on the future of adaptation governance. So let's begin with the first part, and let me start by inviting Dr. Michel Schaffer. He is currently serving as the chief scientist at the Global Center on Adaptation. He's also lead science advisor at Climate Analytics. But he is, and most importantly, has been an author of many UNEP emission and adaptation gap reports, the World Bank, and n number of peer-reviewed papers which have been published in journals like Nature, Science, Nature Climate Change, PNAS, Global Biochemical Cycles, Climate Change, and so on. But recently, he has also been deeply involved in supervising a report, first of its kind, that the Global Center of Adaptation has published. It's called the State and Trends in Adaptation. And also, just a few days back, he was involved in organizing the Global Adaptation Summit. So he's certainly among the most influential experts who are moving and shaping the agenda of adaptation governance. So let's hear the most comprehensive overview of science and policy on adaptation from Dr. Schaffer. Dr. Schaffer, you have about 7-8 minutes.
Thank you very much for those kind words, and also thank you very much for working together with us on this and many other initiatives now and I hope into the future. So I would give a brief overview of the an initial impression of the Climate Adaptation Summit, which happened just a few days ago. We're still working on, through all of the information that has been released, all of the commitments that have been announced and what they mean. So it's really just a few initial words or observations from our side. There is a long lead up to the Climate Adaptation Summit. Originally, it was supposed to happen in October last year already, but because of the COVID-19 crisis, it was now postponed to 25-26 January, hosted by the Dutch government. But we were extremely happy to see a very strong engagement from global leaders and ministers from many different countries. I believe over 50 countries were represented at a leader or ministerial level, and with a lot of engagement from NGOs, from academia, from the private sector. So I believe overall it was, in terms of presence and engagement, it was a very successful summit. It was, if I may say, a large challenge for the hosts and us as a supporting organization to do everything virtually and online. However, I do believe that as a global community, we're finding ways to organize these things more better, as we actually do today under your leadership. Thank you again for that. Before I give a few observations, I also wanted to note that there's a lot of initiatives or momentum in the research community, the knowledge community, all of you, we as an organization. So the government sections, the leader segments of the Climate Adaptation Summit are not a standalone event. They are related and preceded by many other initiatives and events, and just naming two, the Gobeshona conference happening this year out of Bangladesh, I think has been very successful in the week before the Climate Adaptation Summit. And then directly related, also hosted in the Netherlands, where a lot of events on Climate Adaptation Week, one being a whole day of events related to research, knowledge education, past Friday on the 21st of January. And what is important is to connect these events to the political summit, in the sense that, for example, on the Friday we had events with IPCC, convening lead authors and lead authors. We had an event where we presented a global scientist statement launched by a group of 5 Nobel laureates ranging from physics to economics to the Peace Prize, as well as the chair of the IPCC, Professor Sung Lee, and the 8th Secretary General of the UN, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon. And why I'm saying this is because all of those events that happened in, let's say, the research, knowledge, data field, they were forwarded in one way or another as messages into the political summit. And I think this is really important, and something that is usually very commonly happening with these summits, but not always. And I think we still are finding ways to improve the ways that these messages transfer to the leaders' segments. And also in this case, it has not been perfect in the sense that not all messages have been conveyed clearly. All right, so then about the political summit itself, as I mentioned on Monday and Tuesday, this was this had like opening ceremonies with leaders, and then many different anchoring events focusing on different topics, ranging from nature-based solutions and infrastructure, water and food security, but also youth. There was a mayor's forum, and an event focused on locally led adaptation. And I think with this kind of events, not just let's say sectoral, but also focused on some of the non-state actors, that does give a real additional momentum to these kinds of activities. As an event itself, the Climate Adaptation Summit has been important because, as I mentioned, the representation of world leaders and ministers and NGOs, private sector, and I think this has been extremely effective in raising the profile of adaptation, putting it higher on the agenda. Of course, it has been helped by being, one of the first public international appearances of the US, the return of the US in this multilateral or international setting on these kind of topics. John Kerry has been very warmly welcomed back by everyone, but also at government leaders and ministerial level, we had China, India, Bangladesh, Germany, France, the UK, and so on, and that's really significant. Next, there were, of course, a number of initiatives, new initiatives and commitments launched at the summit. Some examples, for example, the US, by words of John Kerry, committed to meeting their international commitments on climate finance, which we interpret as, for example, the $2 billion outstanding US pledge to the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and of course helping developing countries support, including through the $100 billion pledge already for 2020, somehow to make up for lost ground, I would say. Then the African Development Bank, also very substantial. They launched their Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, which is aiming to leverage another $12.5 billion for adaptation in Africa, which we will work also with many other partners, obviously, with the African Development Bank to implement. Another final example is the 1,000 Cities Adapt Now initiatives, which I think could also grow into a very substantial program. It's a 10-year a global program to accelerate and scale adaptation message in cities. What is extremely important now is to follow through. These are initiatives. There were also a lot of initiatives mentioned or updated that already existed, but it is really important to follow through. These are often very complex, many different partners. And so what we want to do with you, many partners, is to monitor, measure what is happening as we move into what we call the decade of action. And one way that the GCA, the Global Center on Adaptation, will do this is through our Adaptation Exchange platform. So this is a new online platform where we bring together a lot of data, expert insights, also building online communities around adaptation, trying to connect the very diverse sources of information that already exist, but we think can be more focused and more targeted to adaptation, to vulnerability, and to coping with climate risks. One final example from the Climate Adaptation Summit, and I think a real substantial development, is the annual ministerial dialogue on adaptation. On Monday, we had the inaugural dialogue on this. And I believe that we have a firm engagement, a firm commitment by governments to engage in this annual dialogue, that we at the GCA will be, I believe, the most important partner organizing as in the years to come. And this creates a very important platform, I think, again, to put adaptation issues higher on the agenda, including the role of non-state and subnational actions and the way that we as a community measure progress, stimulate and mobilize new initiatives, and do our duty, I would say, in following through. Let me thank you again. As I mentioned, these are some additional observations. We're still getting the complete picture ourselves of everything that happens and all of the contributions globally from everybody and how they all link together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Schaffer. I think you made a very important point about the importance of such events as they actually create a way for increasing the profile of adaptation at the international political agenda. That reminds me that it was such events during 1985 and 1990 that actually paved the way for formation of UNFCCC, and some of the very fundamental tenets of the Framework Convention and the global policy, climate policy today emerged from those events. But yes, the following through of these events into concrete actions is equally important, as you pointed out. Now, let me now move to our my colleague in Climate South project, Dr. Sander Chan. He is currently also a senior researcher at Global Center for Adaptation. Previously, he was with the German Development Institute. He's also a member of the steering committee of Galvanizing the Groundswell of Climate Change, Climate Action, which is a network of experts that facilitate a series of dialogues to bring together the actions from cities, regions, companies, and other groups to a higher level of scale and ambition. He's a founding member of the NELD platform on non-economic loss and damage, which draws attention to losses and damages that defy quantification and or monetization, but still matter to people. He is one of, if I can use the term, his obsession with the empirical detail on the type and spread of climate action that the subnational and non-state actors are taking within their local context, but as also part of the transnational climate initiative is really a very great important source of information to fall back on when we think about future of global governance of adaptation. So I'm very keen to hear from Sander his perspective on what we can think about what lies before what achieving the adaptation goal under the Paris Agreement. Over to you, Sander.
Thank you, Manish, and thank you for organizing this very important event on this very important topic. And I was asked to talk about the global adaptation goal and non-state climate action, but maybe first start with what was that global adaptation goal again? So in Paris, countries have set the goal to enhance adaptive capacity, to strengthen resilience, and to reduce vulnerability. This is easier said than done. First, the goal, through its dependency on the temperature goal, is partly quantitative, but it is also, through the diversified adaptation needs and often localized impacts of climate change and actions, it also defies pure quantification. Partly, it is very hard to establish adaptation needs and adequacy of responses in a comparable manner. Moreover, the global adaptation goal in the Paris Agreement is formulated in a very state-centric way. So why do we need to talk about non-state actors such as businesses, investors, civil society, and subnational actors at all in this space? I argue that there's a formal role in the climate regime for non-state actors in adaptation, not necessarily in the Paris Agreement per se, but for instance in the Paris COP decision, which implies non-state contributions along three pathways. First, non-state actions are expected to significantly narrow the global mitigation gap, which in turn affects the risk exposure and the cost and the need for adaptation. Second, non-state actions are expected to provide solutions for governments to accelerate implementation of both mitigation and adaptation targets and to create room for increased ambition. And finally, non-state actions are also expected to directly narrow gaps in adaptation governance by increasing adaptive capacity in specific settings. Now, these three pathways of non-state adaptation impacts, they imply the need to understand interactions between mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development. They imply the need to broker solutions and cooperations between multiple actors, and the need to track the impact of non-state adaptation action. What is the state of non-state adaptation action? Now, generally, we see an enormous groundswell of climate action, even in 2020, a year that is marked, of course, by the global pandemic. You might expect that climate action may be lower on the agenda, lower on the priority list of non-state actors. Yet, we see an unprecedented number of actors committing to, for instance, net zero emissions. The UNFCCC also records an equally unprecedented amount of non-state and national commitments, now more than 27,000 of them. And in the database that we have developed together with partners in this event, the Climate South project, we have developed this database with over 300 cooperative initiatives, and we see a steep growth of climate action in recent years. And for a long time, the number of non-state adaptation actions have lagged behind mitigation actions. However, in recent years, we do see this growth picking up. And mind you, the data for 2020 is not complete, and all those initiatives that have also been launched at the Climate Adaptation Summit have not yet been included. So we do see an uptake, a fast growth of adaptation action as well. In terms of understanding interlinkages, the most promising part is probably mitigation. In recent years, we have seen great advances in understanding the importance of non-state mitigation contributions. Even a limited number of fully scaled and implemented initiatives could put us back on a 2 degrees pathway and significantly narrow the gap towards 1.5. This is significant for adaptation as non-state mitigation actions significantly affect the baseline determining the need and the cost of adaptation. In recent years, we have also seen a growing understanding of the multiplicity of adaptation solutions that come from non-state and subnational actors. So there's for instance, the ongoing technical examination process on adaptation under the UNFCCC, which plays an important role. But we also see that research is providing us a better view of what exactly non-state adaptation efforts entail. At the Climate Action Summit last week, the Climate Adaptation Summit this week, a knowledge exchange platform was launched that Michiel also referred to provide a searchable overview of these state and non-state solutions. However, we also see, while we see kind of this rapid developing solution space at the international level, at the national and regional levels, we don't see the same mechanisms to engage non-state solutions. It is not only institutions around the solution space that need to be further developed. After all, solutions only make sense in the context of their adequacy in the light of the global goal on adaptation. And here we see major challenges to determine the adequacy of adaptation actions and whether they provide adequate support for governments to meet adaptation needs. First, there's a lack of data, especially disaggregated data by actor and locality, whereas most collection of data is at the national level. And second, non-state adaptation is often voluntary. They're very varied. They set their own goals, baselines, and work at different scales, making comparisons and aggregations to understand the progress towards collective goals extremely difficult. So in the South, in the Climate South project, we have developed a minimal progress indicator to track non-state adaptation and mitigation action through a simplified log frame that combines data on functions and outputs of more than 300 large-scale cooperative initiatives. We assess whether these actions display the minimal output performance that is necessary for them to achieve real-world impacts, including improved ecosystems, progress on socio-economic indicators, increased adaptive capacity, but also reduced emissions. Using this method, we find, for instance, that non-state mitigation generally performs much better than non-state adaptation initiatives, but also that the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have interrupted adaptation actions much more severely than mitigation actions. Similarly, we see very different patterns of performance across sectors. Now, of course, and this is my last slide, of course, our tracking efforts are still limited in scope. Much more work is needed in an international collaborative effort to understand the progress and the adequacy of non-state adaptation action. This work includes the definition of specific adaptation indicators for non-state actions, as well as the harmonization of data collection and data concepts across various platforms and research projects. Perhaps even more urgent, at the moment, we see a lot of efforts to mobilize climate adaptation action at the international level, but ultimately implementation is national and local. This implies that we need appropriate mobilization and engagement mechanisms, and also disaggregated information for specific implementation contexts. Finally, we see an increasing number of initiatives to track non-state climate actions, which has great potential to complement each other. To name just a few, there's CAMDA, which gathers the data and analytical community in the UNFCCC space. There's the International Platform on Adaptation Metrics. And last but not least, this week we launched the Climate Initiative Tracker, which will be further developed this year to provide a better understanding of the progress of non-state climate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Sander, for that very comprehensive overview of the knowledge base that is there on non-state action on adaptation and the new developments. I think you very importantly pointed out the importance of the question that how capacities spread across different actors can be networked. Can the network of capacity be conceived of as a part of global governance? But then what would be the measurement challenges therein? So thank you very much for pointing that out. May I now move to the experience and information from Kenya, and request Kennedy Mbiwa, who is a co-convener of a recently launched network, African Research and Impact Network. Kennedy is currently also pursuing his PhD from the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. But as part of the Climate South project, I think he has led a team of very young researchers to develop perhaps the most comprehensive, latest updated database of non-state and subnational action on climate change, which squarely disproves an observation that the subnational and non-state actors are not active in global south. So I'm very keen to hear your perspective and what's happening in Africa. Kennedy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Manish, and I think thank you for the invitation to participate in this seminar. I think it's a very timely topic. I think especially coming after the big conference on adaptation. So I think, as Manish has mentioned, I'm part of the Climate South project, and I and my colleagues were responsible for looking at non-state and sub-state climate action in Kenya. And I think I'd like to make a couple of points. So I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I have some notes, I think, on some points I want to raise. So I think I'll raise a couple of points, but I think 5 key points. I think the first one is just to give you a broad context of the analysis of, and the status of adaptation in Kenya. So Kenya submitted its first NDC, that had several components, I think one including adaptation. And I think the NDC stresses adaptation as a very important element of climate action in the country. And I think there are several reasons for this. One being that the Kenyan economy is highly dependent on agriculture. I think that's very similar to many economies in Africa. But also the country is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, because I think almost 80% of the country is arid and semi-arid. So you can see the two sort of dimensions coming together, where on the one hand, the economy is highly dependent on climate change, on agriculture, and number two, the country is very much exposed to the impacts of climate change. But I think it gets more interesting when you start drilling down and looking at the trends or adaptation priorities of the subnational and non-state actors in Kenya. I think I'll share the findings from our project looking at number one, counties. These are what some would call, for example, states. They're sub-federal entities because we have a federal system of governance. So we have 47 of them in Kenya. And I think as part of our analysis, we looked at what each of the counties was doing on adaptation. We also looked at the companies listed in the Nairobi Stock Exchange. And we also looked at medium and small enterprises. And I think the last category is very important, medium and small enterprises, because they comprise the backbone of the economy. So many of the private sector firms in Kenya are quite small and medium. So I think in many discussions on especially adaptation in Africa or in the global south, you'll find many of these farms not being surveyed. So I think what are some of the patterns then that are coming up from the detailed analysis that we did? Apart from collecting data, we did extensive surveys. So I think that's where we got much of the really insightful information. I think one, first was the issue of capacity and resilience. And you can see sort of the importance of resilience sort of coming up in all the three sectors, and it was very important. For most of the small and medium enterprises, for instance, they were quite oriented on agriculture, especially the medium-sized enterprises. Most of them have to do with agriculture, whether it's agricultural produce, processing agricultural products, etc. So I think the issue of capacity was very important, and that is the capacity to respond to these issues, which is climate change adaptation. Looking at the counties, for instance, many of the counties were quite exposed to the impacts of climate change. And being new entities which started sort of operation in 2013, so that's only 8 years or 7 years ago, the counties have been really struggling to build their capacity to deal with the impacts of climate change, be it droughts, especially droughts, and flooding, flash flooding. I think another aspect that came up was technical capacity, especially for the counties, where some counties had a climate change office and of course the Department of Environment, but other counties did not. And most of the people who are responsible for dealing with climate change or adaptation issues usually found that their docket or their work overlapped with several other departments, and so it was quite difficult getting so that technical capacity to effectively implement sort of the necessary adaptation measures. I think the issue was even more challenging for the small and medium enterprises because they have very limited resources and they don't have that sort of big capital base. So I think responding to climate change has been a big challenge to many of them, especially those in the agriculture sector. I think the second point that is quite important, third point that came up, was the issue of knowledge, where I think there were very interesting understandings of adaptation. So for some adaptation, or for most adaptation, cuts across many issues. So for example, actors, be they companies or counties that were in areas that rely on a lot on agriculture, water was a very big issue in agriculture. And for those, for example, that were in urban areas like Nairobi, water was more important than, for example, other aspects of adaptation. So I think we find there is that knowledge of adaptation cutting across sectors, but still not much understanding, for example, of having enough knowledge to build early warning systems. So I think the issue of knowledge was there, where there are disparate types of knowledge, but it wasn't consolidated. So I think the next point, which is related, is the issue of financing, because responding, of course, to climate change, to adaptation, requires resources. So for some of the counties, they were able to mobilize some of the resources that they had. Others who had connections to international partnerships or international partners could leverage such kind of funding. But I'd also note that Kenya has access to the Adaptation Fund as well as the Green Climate Fund. And it has been a bit challenging for example, the non-state actors, especially the private actors, to get access to that kind of funding, especially developing a business proposal or a business case for an adaptation project is not that easy. So I think getting to my last point, which sort of came out clearly from the data, was the issue of the core benefits of adaptation and mitigation, where the two are not that clear-cut. And I think a clear example that showed how some of the, for example, the technologies that are being used by some of these, especially private companies, small and medium companies dealing in agriculture. For example, the use of solar irrigation. So on the one hand, for example, the solar water pumps provide a clean source of energy, but on the other hand, they also help in efficiently utilizing water, but also getting water to places which are being affected by, maybe erratic rainfall. So I think I'll round it at that and say one last thing we'll be doing is trying to consolidate the data through the African Non-State Climate Action Platform, which we hope to develop later this year. And the whole idea is to sort of touch on the point that Manish and I think the project in general has raised, which there's so much going on, but number one, we need it to be visible, and then number two, we need to understand it better. So I think I'll end there, Manish, but I'll be happy to take any questions for clarification later. Thank you.
Thank you, Kennedy, for that wonderful presentation. I think 2 points are very important that you made, that all actors matter, but while they are willing to take action, there is a question of capacities relating to governance, technical, and resources. So what happens if the national governments themselves are lacking in those capacities? That's a big question for global governance of adaptation. While the international networks can be a source of filling those gaps, to what extent we can rely on them. And the second point of co-benefits, I think it's very important for governance. We have a relatively well-developed governance structure for mitigation. So if there are co-benefits, does it mean we can embed adaptation governance into governance of mitigation, or should we do it at all? Are there any fundamental differences? These are going to be important questions for global governance of adaptation. So thank you for that. Now let me ask my colleague Mekla from TERI, who has also been part of the Global Climate South project. And I'm happy that to also introduce her as one of our ex-students at TERI School of Advanced Studies, who is working on these important issues. She's also sharing the responsibilities of Adaptation Futures Secretariat, so a lot of logistics works, but very important. So over to you, Mekla.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Manish. Hello, everyone. Today, my presentation is going to focus on some of the findings from the Climate South project and also the barriers and the gaps that we have identified in this through this project for adaptation action in India. So, I mean, we've already gone through this. Paris, the Article 7 talking about the global adaptation goal and the need to engage all state, subnational, and non-state actors to align political will with the adaptation needs of today and to build long-term resilience as well. And given India's macroeconomic context, there is a need to mainstream climate change into the developmental process because development is a priority in the country. And it has been noted that adaptation is strongly embedded in the local developmental context, and therefore there is a need for integration with existing developmental action itself. And it also becomes imperative that resilience is built across levels in the country. And the pandemic only goes to show that there are compounding risks that must be addressed, and there is a need to enhance adaptation action and build long-term resilience. So for the Climate South project, there were 3 actors that were looked at: states, cities, and companies. There were 30 states, 46 cities with a million-plus population, and 46 companies based on their market capitalization in the Bombay Stock Exchange. And data was collected through desk-based research and was supplemented with interactions with experts and officials from state nodal agencies, city officials, and experts within the corporate space. Secondary data has shown that there is heightened exposure in both states and cities to various climatic risks and vulnerabilities. So most states have experienced one risk, climate-related risk in the past 10 years, like floods, droughts, extreme weather, biological events. And data also shows us that these risks have been duly identified as future risks at a policy level. In the case of cities, more than 50% of the cities that we studied showed that they had experienced some form of climatic event like floods, droughts, or biological risk over the last 10 years. And cities identify flooding, extreme weather, and biological risks as very high future risks. In terms of companies, the data collected showed that the most important challenges faced by companies are in the areas of energy insecurity, floods, extreme weather events, and cyclones or sea level rise. Now, if you move on to understanding the kind of action that is there within each of these actors, it is very well known that in states in India, any sort of climate action is embedded within the developmental process. And specifically, climate action is steered through the state action plans on climate change, which are based off of the national action plans on climate change. So our data collected can be categorized into two categories. One, direct action, which is determined by local responses, or indirect action, which is a top-down policy action which comes from the center. Now, the central government mandates states are required to develop disaster management policies based on the Central Disaster Management Act of 2005. But our data shows that not all states have these policies that directly address these risks, particularly those that are biological and extreme weather events. But it has been noted that the risk related to flooding and water availability are relatively better addressed in terms of policy provisions at the state level. Moving on to cities, the action in cities is the majority of action in cities is based or is a part of national level schemes or programs to address certain risks. They are addressed primarily through the centrally mandated disaster management plans. And data also shows us that there are some initiatives by city administration to address certain risks, but this kind of action is mostly taken after a city has experienced a certain risk. An example for this would be the city of Ahmedabad, developing a heat wave action plan after it had a devastating event that occurred in 2010. Now, a few cities also undertake very highly context-specific action, and the best example for this would be city-level disaster management plans. And there are only a handful of cities in those 46 cities that have specific city-level disaster management plans. Our data also shows that action in cities is driven by partnerships, which are both formal and informal. And this is sort of emerging as a novel mode of governance in cities in India. Now, onto companies. The data collected for companies is based on CSR reports and sustainability reports that are available publicly. And only 15 companies report any action that resembles that have a resemblance to resilience targets or action towards building resilience to climate change. And there are only a handful of companies that report measure any sort of progress or have even dedicated funding or staff for this kind of action. However, we also noted that 42 companies report actions related to SDGs, and there were 32 of them that even had measurable, quantifiable progress. Our data also shows us that there is no sort of reporting of any barriers to carrying out these actions, whether related to building resilience or SDGs itself. Now, a few companies also report to being a part of transnational sustainability initiatives or domestic climate initiatives, and even domestic business associations or transnational business networks. Now, these are a few points that can expand on the emerging narrative in India on climate adaptation action. Now, most of the action is embedded in developmental policies. It is driven by national policies and guidelines, and actions by subnational actors are also driven by local event experiences that they have. Now, there are several instances that have been noted about financial assistance-based partnership, either in cities or states with other transnational and domestic funding agencies that drives climate action in those actors. Now, for both states and cities, it is not always possible to clearly demarcate or assess the existence of action or even the progress on action. As I mentioned, this is because of the fact that it's embedded within developmental policies. And actions by companies are largely voluntary, which I think Dr. Sandachan also mentioned from his presentation. And they, in India, they primarily respond to climate policy discourse, the climate policy discourse in the country, and to some extent, in anticipation of regulation in the future. Now, companies have been noted to report and track progress on mitigation action, but their intent on adaptation action is generally not well documented, despite the fact that they recognize certain climate risks as has high risks in the future. Now, these are some of the gaps that were identified within each of these actors. Since climate action is embedded in state developmental policies for states, there is often ambiguity in terms of measuring and evaluating the progress of these actions. Now, states also are mandated by the center to have nodal climate offices, but these offices do not necessarily have any financial or regulatory powers to take forward climate action or enhance climate action. One of the significant barriers or gaps that we identified was the lack of finance for the implementation of climate action. And the other major barrier has been monitoring and evaluation with regard to the implementation of the state action plans on climate change. Now, in cities, the action is usually driven by past events and international relationships. And data suggests that cities more often than not take action only after having experienced a disaster, a climatic disaster of some kind. Now, partnerships have emerged as a very strong driver for action in cities, and this is steered through the interests of an international organization or an external funding agency. However, the effectiveness of action, of any of this action, cannot be gauged in cities because of the lack of data, and it can be only done through qualitative engagement with the relevant stakeholders. Now, in terms of companies, the publicly available CSR reports and sustainability reports have rather limited information. And these companies do not really have a centralized reporting or disclosure mechanism. And it is very difficult to infer any sort of effectiveness of the action itself or any partnership that companies take up in the form of climate action. Now, to talk about what is required to achieve the global adaptation goal, India would need to move towards a more robust adaptation governance. At the global level, there is a need to ensure a sustained flow of finance and capacity to support developing countries, along with creating platforms for the easy access of knowledge and experience sharing between all of these actors. At the national level, clear policy framework is required to guide different actors across different levels of governance, particularly on monitoring and evaluation. At the subnational level, there is a need to mainstream the SAPCCs into different sectors to enhance the ambit of climate action and involve diverse group of actors to address particular vulnerabilities. Now, at the city level, while there have been instances of a lot of action taking place in many cities, there is no form of experience sharing or mutual learning between these cities, and there is a need for creating formal platforms to enable this. At the non-state or the corporate level, it has been noted that most corporates work in silos, and CSOs, civil society organizations, can play a vital role in identifying risks and opportunities for these companies to strengthen their action in the space of adaptation. I will stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mekhala, for detailing out the nature of complexity of the actions and issues involved, as well as very pointed way forward suggestions. I think all the presentations have provided a very rich information base to think through for adaptation governance. I invite the participants to type in their questions in the question and answer box. I also have my eye on the watch, so we are about to. We should have actually started our panel discussion segment. So I invite the questions, and I would request the panelists that if they could kindly use the Q&A box to respond to those questions. In the meanwhile, let me thank all the panelists for very rich presentations, and now move to the second segment of this webinar, which is to deliberate on the future of adaptation governance in the light of information we have just heard. And for that, I'm happy to welcome back Dr. Schaffer, along with Dr. Thomas Hale, Mr. David Howlett, and Professor Colleen Vogel. David Howlett is the head of policy at the Global Resilience Partnership. He is seconded from the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. He has over 35 years experience in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, with an academic background as diverse as chemistry, soil sciences, and agriculture. Is very widely published. He is also seconded to the high-level champions team for the upcoming COP, and where he co-leads on supporting the Race to Resilience campaign. He has been part of very important resilience programs such as building resilience and adaptation to climate extreme disasters. He was also the UK government's lead on climate smart agriculture, and in that capacity co-convened investment action group of the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture. Professor Colleen Vogel is a distinguished professor at the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. She is a climatologist by training, but has very deep interest in the social dimensions of climate change, focusing on adaptation. She has chaired and been the vice chair of international global environmental change scientific committees such as IHDP, LUCC, Earth System Science Program, or the Future Earth developments. She is currently serving on various local and international boards. She has been associated with the influential 4th and 5th IPCC assessment reports as lead author and co-authors of many chapters. She has been the recipient of the Bertoni Award for International Excellence in Adaptation Research, as well as the University of the Witwatersrand Vice Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. She has published some very interesting research on the role of teachers and the private sector in adaptation. Thomas is associate professor at the Oxford University's Blavatnik School of Government, and his research explores on addressing and managing transnational problems effectively and fairly. He is interested in exploring the dynamics through which political institutions evolve or not in the light of global challenges and multiple types of interdependencies. Of course, with a focus on environmental, economic, and health issues. He has published many books on this theme. He holds a PhD in politics from Princeton University and master's in global politics of London School of Economics. For us, he has been our co-PI for the Climate South project. So with this panel, we have an equally and very illustrious moderator in Mr. R.R. Rashmi. He is currently a distinguished fellow at TERI, but he has been part of the Indian government and the Ministry of Environment and Forest during period when the most of the formal climate policy of India, starting from the National Action Plan on Climate Change, involvement of states through State Action Plan on Climate Change, took their concrete governance shape. He has been a special secretary in the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change. And in that capacity has been closely associated with formulation and implementation of climate policies, pollution, Montreal Protocol on ODS, environmental clearances, as well as being project director of Green India Mission. He also serves on many subcommittees of the Ministry of Government, including the Ministry of Finance Committee on Climate Finance. He's a member of the technical advisory body of the International Civil Aviation Organization for using of emission units for CORSIA. He also advises National Agricultural Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development in the context of international climate business. He co-chairs the Biofuel Standards Development Group of the Network for Certification and Conservation of Forests in India. He is also the member of the committee looking at the global ambition in the global stocktake process. So he certainly has a very deep experience in developing country context and the complexities of climate policy and adaptation. So I think I'm certain that the next one are going to be an treat in terms of rich practical and academic experience and issues in adaptation governance. So over to you, Mr. Rashmi.
Thank you very much, Manish. I hope I'm audible and clear to everyone.
Yes, we can see you and we can hear you.
Thank you. Let me first warmly welcome all the panelists to our discussion today. this evening. Considering the title of the program that we have, of how we can govern the adaptation with local actors and global networks. And the four panelists that we have today, Manish has already introduced them, so I'll not go over this again. But considering the rich experience of our panelists, I would like to request them to address some of the specific questions which I think may be pertinent for the purpose of highlighting the governance issues at the subnational, the non-state actor level, with particular reference to adaptation. In fact, although the studies do point out that many of the developing countries may lack in terms of capacity, many research initiatives have also led to the conclusion that it is actually not just the capability or the capacity or the knowledge. What actually lacks is a system at the global and the national level and at the state level, which mobilizes these communities into actions. In many countries and in most of the communities, actually, they are already battling the impacts of climate change. They all have their own knowledge systems and experiences in how to battle the adverse impacts of climate change. You can see in my own country, I can see the communities in Ladakh, which is a snowbound region. They know how to irrigate their fields, despite the fact that there are snow-clad mountains all around and the water is not available to them. Similarly, in the flood-prone areas or in the coastal areas, it's not the knowledge which people lack. It is actually the research information, the coordinated management of the resources, the mobilization of finance at different levels of governance, which is lacking. We will perhaps need to discuss these issues. Fortunately, the Paris Agreement has opened a new dimension. Now, Paris Agreement allows all the governments to take actions which they consider most critical and important. And this applies not only to mitigation, this also applies to adaptation. All of them are expected to incorporate the goals which they consider important in their NDCs. Now, nationally determined contributions in many countries, adaptation tops the rank. And then they are expected to take adaptation actions. So the critical question for them is not as if they lack knowledge. But the critical question for them would be, where do they mobilize resources? How do they equip the communities? How do they empower them in terms of abilities and capacities to take their actions forward, to expand and augment their actions? The Paris Agreement, the other thing which it did, and which is almost transformational in terms of governance, is that it allowed for the first time the non-state actors, the corporates, the other agencies which function independently, also to contribute to these national and global actions, and also that their actions can be accounted for. So it creates an opportunity for these local actions, non-state actions, subnational actions to be accounted for. Of course, it has to be a part of the overall national actions and the national commitments, but it does give a possibility of recognizing these actions independently. But what are the systems which we have in place at the global level for these actions to be recognized? Do we have enough incentives? Do we have enough reward systems? Do we have enough systems of reporting for these actions? So I would, in fact, like our panelists today to address some of these questions from this angle. And let me now invite, I'll not speak anymore. In fact, I'll go over to the panelists. And first of all, I'd like to invite Dr. Thomas Hale, who from the University of Oxford, And considering the fact that he has very rich experience in global politics and the study of international politics, the question which I had in mind for him was, the scope of international cooperation in case of mitigation is very straightforward. We have discussed it a number of times. And the mitigation, for advancing mitigation efforts, we need standardized technologies and finance. So its case is very straightforward, but which is perhaps not the case in case of adaptation. So, Dr. Hale, what do you think should be a appropriate framework for international cooperation in case of adaptation, and particularly when the non-state actors are considered as the key actors? Dr. Hale, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Ashman. It's a pleasure to have such a great panel joining us today, and thank you to Adaptation Futures team for organizing this event. It's been a fascinating discussion so far. So let's speak exactly to this issue of that Mr. Rashmi has raised about what the framework for global cooperation on adaptation looks like, specifically vis-a-vis sub and non-state actors, and how that framework could be more effective, perhaps going forward, in making these contributions more effective, more grow and make them more effective and impact. So I think just to start from the observation that this whole realm of subnational non-state action has become a really important, powerful trend in the broader international regime, as a number of speakers have already mentioned. If you look at the candidates under the UN's Global Climate Action Portal, you see, as Andrew mentioned, 27,000 different actions. Those actions are being taken by something like 6,000 individual cities and subnational governments around the world that, if you add them all up, account for something like 20% of the human population. And if you look at the businesses represented on that portal, you find about 6,000 businesses whose annual revenue is around 36 trillion US dollars. In other words, more than the GDPs of China and the United States combined. So this kind of trend towards sub and non-state action is really a kind of climate superpower that is fundamentally reshaping the nature of the international regime. But what's interesting, of course, is not just to see what commitments are, but how they're delivering on the ground. And this is, of course, a really important question going forward as we in the FGLC process shift from the sort of negotiation phase to the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement, and how we think about the cycles of revision going forward under the next decades. And here, I think the role of this whole groundswell of non-state climate action has a really important role to play to help and partner with countries to deliver and enhance and strengthen and make sure NDCs are well rooted in the implementation that is needed on the ground and the actors who can help to deliver that, but also to, through their own actions, create conditions under which all actors will feel more confident to move forward toward the goals the treaty has set. And so this kind of lockstep between this loop, if you will, between the national process and the international process and the subnational non-state processes is really a powerful driver, a powerful engine that I think will help us move forward. But I think we have to be very honest with ourselves. And let's be blunt, these global networks of sub and non-state actors have been much more focused today on mitigation than adaptation. That's clear in the data that Sandra showed us before, and also clear to anyone who's attended any of these global climate action events in the past 5 years or so. And that's a huge barrier, I think, to the full effectiveness of the system going forward. And it really manifests in lots of different ways. I was looking this morning before this event at the latest TCFD report. This is a task force on climate-related financial risks. What kind of risks are the world's largest companies who are now increasingly doing this kind of disclosure? What are they reporting? So the vast majority of them are actually reporting more of the what they call transition risk. In other words, the risk they face from decarbonization, as opposed to the physical risk from the impacts of climate change. And that's really interesting to me because usually we think about climate impacts and climate risks as the process of climate change that's unleashing changes onto our societies, not necessarily the process of decarbonization, although of course that also has important transition issues to impacts that must be addressed to be successful. But if you look at this kind of imbalance in that report and in the data that's kind of presented, you really see, I think, why this issue is so important now. I think we all know there's a lot of reasons for this imbalance. Probably the one that we've been most focused on in the Climate South project is looking at who the actors are who have been driving many of the global networks of sub and non-state actors. Often many of them are based in the global north. Even though we see a transition over recent years to growing leadership, growing participation, growing emphasis on from actors in the global south on these issues, it's still very much a work in progress. And so I think that's the most sort of straightforward example. But that's now also changing because sadly, the impacts of climate change are increasingly felt by actors in the global north, and they always have been really. But think about an issue like an event like Hurricane Sandy, which hit New York City very forcefully. Really saw the city government of New York change and kind of shift its own balance there between the mitigation and adaptation tracks after that catastrophic event. And so I think we'll see an increasing shift on this from all actors, the north and the south, going forward. But that's not really, we can't sort of sit back and wait for the climate to force us to change. What a good governance system should do is reach out and be proactive and to build adaptation and resilience proactively going forward. And I think as we, and that idea I think really gels quite well with the broader shifts we're seeing in the international regime. So as I said before, we're moving perhaps from a negotiation phase, still a few things of course to negotiate, but really much more to thinking about how we implement the NDCs that governments are putting forward and how we help improve that implementation, make sure it's also reaching up toward the goals set out in the Paris Agreement. And that means that we have to really get to where action happens on the ground, where actual decisions about investments and policy are made. And of course, that naturally puts a lot more emphasis on the local level because no matter what system of government countries are operating under, ultimately, many of these things have to be built by in a certain place. And that place has people and local authorities and businesses who are naturally in communities who are naturally connected to it. So the sort of shift implementation is also, I think, driving us more toward that kind of on the ground nature, which will inevitably and positively increase our views of adaptation. I'm very delighted to see that some of the climate action processes in the UN system are increasingly looking at questions of adaptation and resilience. I'm delighted that David Howlett is here from the Global Climate Champions team, who will tell us much more about that in a minute. This is a huge development. I think that's really welcome. It's been, perhaps too long in coming, but it's really wonderful to see it happening now. And let me just close by what sort of might look like going forward. So, if before the logic of subnational non-state action was this, some of us have described as a groundswell, really getting the front runners to lead, to show what's possible, to inspire others to follow, maybe to put a bit of pressure onto others to follow, to kind of get the front runners running as quickly as possible. That's been this kind of modus operandi of the climate action space over the last 5 years. But as we now shift to implementation, as we think about the rising side of impacts, we need to focus much more, I think, not just on the front runners, but on those who are struggling to keep pace. We need less, if you will, a groundswell approach of letting the, highlighting leaders and spotlighting leadership, and more on kind of an all of society approach. We're actually thinking about the pace as not just how quickly the front runners are running, but how much we're bringing everyone along. And that shift, I think, is a really important phase for the next development of this global regime complex, if you will, emerging around sub and non-state actors in the climate space. And that, I think, will mean that adaptation and resilience must and should and can play a much larger role than it has in the past. And I'm really excited to think about how our Climate South project, through the data contributions and others, can contribute to making that shift happen. Because I think it will hopefully allow this new phase of global climate cooperation to quickly move beyond some of the imbalances that we've seen in the past. So that's my hope for us, Mr. Rashmi, and I look forward to seeing what others say.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Thanks very much for giving your insights for this issue. Yes, the adaptation, the whole focus has to be more on the ground actions, and we have to mobilize investments and encourage the ground level actors through policy interventions and other programs to be able to expand their capacity and enhance their capacity. Thank you very much. Let me now go over to Professor Colleen Gale. Professor, you have studied the social dimensions of climate change, although you are a climatologist, but you have studied the other dimensions from a very close quarters. So, so I would like to understand from you how you have looked at the role of the non-state actors, particularly the corporate sector, the private sector, and the other actors, when assuming that the governments at the central and the state level, different elements of the federal structure in different countries, become more conscious of adaptation and start in looking at adaptation as an equally important issue as mitigation is. How do you think private sector and these non-state actors can contribute to these actions, and what is it that can be done to help them efficiently implement the adaptation related actions?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this chance to share and to be part of this great panel. These are very big questions and requiring very deep and thoughtful answers. So what I would like to do is just first set up a bit of an overarching frame and then come to some of your issues if I have time. So, there's been a lot of work done on adaptation in the past. Adaptation, the arena has been growing and growing and growing as we get more and more social scientists and humanities and other thinkers, knowledge bearers and knowledge holders into the system. But one of the things that I think we need to do is to just kind of step back a little bit before we rush along into, races for resilience, although I think it's urgent. Because I think we need to be asking about, and Mekhala actually mentioned it quite a lot, and the same thing is happening in my country, is that it seems that all the efforts are to link in the climate efforts into adaptation, into development policy. But I think the questions have to be asked, whose development, what purposes, and who's benefiting from those developments. So we hear a lot about smart development, smart agriculture, smart, etc. We hear some people even questioning, I don't want to be made resilient anymore. I want to fix the structures that are actually making me not resilient. And so for me, my concern, and then I will come to your question, is that I think we've lost touch with nature and society, how we interact with nature and society. And there's a very brilliant set of seminars that is ongoing at the moment, run by Ubiquity University, called Humanity Rising. And what is coming out of those seminars, which are daily, is that maybe the focus shouldn't be so much on, sustainability and how can we sustain what we have for the next generations, etc., but rather on a more generative approach. And so to answer your question, two geographers, Head and Gibson, recently spoke about that regeneration. How could we become differently modern? So I'm a little bit more cautious about doing the resilience, doing the adaptation, doing the disaster risk reduction, which I've been involved in for many, many years. And in my old age, I'm starting to question a lot more about what is the question and where are we trying to go? Do we have the trajectory where we want to go? So I think now that the United States is back in the mix, we're going to have some very interesting discussions with several elephants in the room that are going to obviously be unveiled. So let me give you an example. I think you can't really talk about the private sector in a vacuum because we have to be thinking about these regenerative processes. So are you going to go like, for example, economic growth only, which is much needed, but perhaps that kind of growth focus and paradigm needs to be seriously challenged. Because if you take a growth paradigm and you just follow it to its end, you get caught up in the technocratic debates. You get caught up in this pursuit of indicators, etc., etc. And so, I would say many critical thinkers are now thinking about alternative ways of looking at the economy. This regenerative approach, stepping back a little bit and saying, humanity really needs to get in touch with nature, and COVID's showing us that as well. So, for example, donut economics. Kate Raworth and others are saying maybe we need a different kind of approach, not to say that we don't need economic growth at all, but let's really start to interrogate that. Well-being approaches, etc., etc. So if you start to enter it from those different types of angles, you start to get different kinds of metrics, different kinds of data that you require. So for example, is it just hardcore data that you need, or people's narratives? In South Africa, different groups who are coming at this from these kinds of different angles. So there's the National Business Initiative, which is a coalition of different companies from all across South Africa, Africa itself, and also internationally. And they are really trying to talk about water, energy, etc., all those nexus, etc. But then I also have a different cohort of academics and activists and scholars and friends who are writing the climate justice narrative, you know, the climate justice charter, going to Parliament and asking about decarbonization and with a strong justice dimension. So I think we need to really be thinking about, are we just looking for a search for more knowledge, more information? You know, to be honest, I've worked in this field for 30 years. We know quite a lot now about what happens when it rains with poor and marginal communities. And, you know, communities are kind of asking, when are you going to come and actually help to change the system that is producing where I live? I live in a marginal river, so it's not surprising that when it rains just a little bit, our livelihood gets washed away. So I think these are some of the deeper questions, much more nuanced questions. And so I'd just like to end by saying there's a very great, also another nice network, if you want to follow, called Perspectiva. And they say we need to be thinking of systems, souls, and society. So do we just need knowledge? Or, and I think in the Indian traditions and the African traditions, or do we also need wisdom coming from contemplative practices, etc.? So what does that mean in a corporate sense? A friend of mine who's doing quite a lot of work on thrivability gives a lovely example of this. She says, wouldn't it be interesting if you went into boardrooms where the triple bottom line and, you know, the shareholders and those issues are critical, but if with the baby in his arms and looked down at the baby and said, so folks, how are we going to run adaptation so that this individual in my arms can thrive one day? And I think that might make us have a little bit more of a nuanced approach as opposed to only just, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all the work on indicators, etc., shouldn't happen. But I do think from my experience, we need to be bringing in these other knowledge perspectives and really in some places being very transgressive and holding governments to account. If it is a development issue, then let's hold governments account to that. But often you've got to be careful because you're an academic, you're not a politician. But in my country and in India, I think, and in many countries, we have huge corruption. We have raping of the state treasury coffers. And then we ask, you know, how do we work on adaptation? So I think I just want to leave it there. And I think companies, especially in the climate adaptation Netherlands event, I just want to compliment the organizers because I think it was brilliant. I'm working with a lot of young people, and what I really liked was the entrepreneurial invitations coming from companies who are saying, let's get the young people who are going to be facing this into the rooms. So I don't think I've given you a nice nugget that says, here's the answer, but I hope I've just been a little bit more provocative perhaps, because I do think the time for action is now, but then we've got to be very serious about the political dimensions of that, the social dimensions of that, and even the consciousness dimensions. For example, what's the role of eco-villages, small communities, what do those roles play? Skills, cooperatives, does it always have to be big companies, etc., etc., etc.? So I'll leave it there, but I hope I've kind of opened up a few other boxes into the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. No, it was fabulous. You gave a very interesting perspective to the whole question of how we are dealing with the issue of adaptation, both at the global and at the local levels. You know, we have been talking about mainstreaming adaptation into developmental programs, but you are, on the other hand, questioning the whole model of development itself, and you're suggesting that we need to look at the fundamentals of the way we are living and using in nature and the resources. We need to change that model, and that has to be that concern has to be built in there. Naturally, this is a very fundamental issue, and I'm sure this also needs some policy interventions. This does require some financial packages at the global and the national level. So in a way, they have their own interlinkages. But thank you very much for pointing this out. And then the role of private sector can perhaps be explored better if we are able to look at these fundamental questions. Now let me invite Dr. Michael Schaefer, who has earlier spoken about the Adaptation Summit, the kind of initiatives which have been launched there, and he has extremely rich experience in the field of climate change. So the question which Dr. Schaefer, I would like to address to you is about the overall question of the global regime for effective adaptation. A question which Dr. Hale answered in the beginning to some extent, but I'd like to rephrase this question once again to you and then request you to tell you from your perspective, how do we address this overall question of global finance, mobilizing finance for adaptation, building capacity at the global level, and then empowering the local governments and the non-state actors. Over to you, Dr. Schaefer.
Thank you very much again, and it is a very rich conversation, and as Professor Vogel said, there are very big questions, and we can only start to touch on them a little bit in this panel. So let me start actually here by saying that I'm a physicist, and I'm saying this because it, although I've worked for decades on the climate change problem, and I've always worked with social scientists, political scientists, economists. Somehow I retain a perspective of a physicist, which means that I do love to measure things. So it's one reason why I'm a great admirer of Sander Chan's work as well, because he and the whole community that he works with, we're all trying to measure things that are really, really difficult to measure. Nonetheless, I also really appreciate and understand Professor Vogel's points about there is a moment where you have a lot of knowledge, and the question is, so what do you do with it, and who is empowered to act on that knowledge that is being developed. So there's a couple of things that I just wanted to bring forward here. First is indeed referring back to the Climate Adaptation Summit. I think it is a place where we can create more of a platform with youth, with bringing higher up the agenda the concepts and ideas about locally led adaptation. So it's a major work stream in where we work, and we just opened in, when was it, September last year? We opened a regional office in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, which is specializing in locally led adaptation, developing the methodologies and networks, working with an extremely diverse range of actors beyond government, to try to bring in better the perspectives of local communities, and it is hugely diverse, obviously. So it's a big challenge. But nonetheless, I do think these initiatives can help raising that to a, it's a bit paradoxical, of course. You have local perspectives and you somehow want to raise them to a global level of attention, and then try to create pathways for communities, for NGOs, for example, to get more access to resources. And some of those resources obviously have to do with finance, as you say, Jani. For me, it is an open question what the best mechanisms are, and this is also one of the points that we were making in our recent State and Transit Adaptation report, that we still need a lot more creativity and innovation in the financial channels, mechanisms to provide the support that is needed. You know, the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, they have their private sector facility. It's doing, I believe, some effective work, but focused on the private sector. As I understand, the GCF is working with partners. Some partners are, I think, in Germany, to construct facilities or funding for local NGOs. I think there's a program in East Africa. Maybe our earlier speaker or earlier panelist from Kenya knows more about this. That is actively trying to scale up funding facilities and ease access for local NGOs, sorry, to access such funding. So in other words, I think there's really a long way to go there. I do think that it's very clear that there should be that slow, gradual change towards supporting local action, but it is still a matter of finding the best ways to do so. And in a sense, you know, decades of global collaboration and development is not always giving the best examples, if I may. So it is still a matter of finding new and better working solutions, which I don't have. I wish I had, and need to work towards. I think I will leave it there, because I do think that we are slowly running out of time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schaefer. This is an honest admission which you're making, is that we are still in the process of working it out, and we need to innovate. There is some work being done by institutions like GCF, but this is a work in progress, and we are still trying to find our ways. The best mechanisms are yet to come. Certainly, this is a difficult question because adaptation is absolutely is global, but at the same time extremely local, and finding the right mechanisms is certainly extremely difficult, and we will have to be innovative about it. Thank you very much. Let me now go to Dr. David Howlett, who is perhaps waiting because he was supposed to speak earlier, but somehow I know I was not able to capture the order of the speakers properly. But with my apologies to Dr. Howlett, let me now go over to him and then ask him, about the relevance of the kind of work that we are doing today. We talked about the databases about climate information emerging from NASCA and Climate South project, which documents what is happening at the subnational level and in the non-state actors domain. The question which I had in mind was, this is all very fine, but where do we go from these databases? What insights do they offer for global governance for adaptation? Dr. Howlett, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Coming late actually worked very, very well. I'm getting a bit of feedback, so hopefully others can hear me clearly. It really is going to pick up from Colleen and others. First, to thank TERI and for putting this on. This is really important. The key thing, and I'm working with the high-level champions, that's Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Munzes, one from the UK, one from Chile. They're appointed by their Prime Minister or President to lead the climate action of non-state actors. So it's really exciting. On Monday at the Adaptation Summit, lots of things happened, and Michelle has captured all of them. But Race to Resilience was launched, which is, it's got the simple target of building the resilience of 4 billion people by 2030 and mobilizing businesses, investors, academia, and other stakeholders to do that. So that is a really ambitious target. There's lots of help we need from this community, particularly on the metric side, and that I'm going to come with art actually in my presentation. So how can you help us on the metrics on that? And that goes to the Global Centre. So Sander, we need to touch base, and Colleen and others, and IPAM. So And we've actually got McKinsey's has started doing some work with us on that already. So that's the first big ask. So what is Race to Resilience going to do? It's going to mobilize initiatives from local, national, regional, global to contribute to this global target of making 4 billion people resilient. And that will be people like Slumdwellers International working with cities to take people out of slums, make them resilient, making 300 million smallholder farmers accessing better technologies. And also we're going after the trillions. The 100 billion figure under Paris is really important, but as the UNEP GAP report this last week and others, it's not sufficient. We need to get the trillions of private investment flowing into both a resilient and a net zero world. So we got a Race to Zero under the champions, champion getting to the net zero, Race to Resilience, and also we need to think about how do we mobilize trillions of dollars, rupees, pounds, euros to do that. That's both domestic investment, and so it's not all about the GCF or the GEF, it's not about donors. And the other thing about the Race to Resilience, this is a global campaign. We need resilience built in India, in Tanzania, Bolivia, the Netherlands, the UK, Canada, China. It's a global campaign. So that was picking up on what people said earlier. So I did a short PowerPoint presentation, which I know I'd like if the organisers can share. That gives you more details. And also, the second half is if you're part of an initiative and would like to join, expressions of interest are open now, and welcome initiatives from national, regional, and global side. I should also flag, particularly important for this community, there's two initiatives that I think are very relevant. One is the Adaptation Research Alliance, which is also launched at the CAS. That is mobilizing particularly research funders and research organizations to deliver research which is going to meet the questions which we all have. Also linked to, I'm based with the Global Resilience Partnership, Resilience Knowledge Coalition was also wasn't launched at CAS but is moving ahead. That was led by I think many of you know Salim Hook from Bangladesh, his centre, and also the Climate Development Knowledge Network, which is hosted by South North, and they're based out of Cape Town in South Africa. So some really exciting things about how do we apply knowledge, how do we develop knowledge. And I think really, really, really important for this session is the locally led principles for adaptation were also launched at CAS at the summit on Monday. These are setting up how we need to focus on action at the local level. And building resilience isn't done by governments. It isn't done by CEOs. It's done by communities and businesses and cities and towns at the local level. So one of the key things I think Michelle is we need to get those resources to where they matter at that local level. We need to get knowledge to where it matters. We also need to get knowledge from local communities, indigenous knowledge, along with the best scientific knowledge. I'm a scientist by background, a chemist, and not a physicist, but that's where I'm coming from. So there's real opportunities to do this and to link the local to the regional to the global, so we really deliver the action on the ground which is needed. And the action needs to start today. So Race to Resilience, I say, the metrics is going to be a big challenge, but we're not going to wait until we've got the perfect metrics before we start taking action. So really want to invite all of you on this call to how do we make 4 billion people more resilient by 2030, starting yesterday, not today and not tomorrow. Let me finish there because we are running out of time. And if the organisers share the PowerPoint, it's got a bit more detail, but crucially, it's got the links to that. And I'm also seeing in the chat box, Sandra and Michelle, we need to talk. We're going to be convening with McKinsey's on how we start these forward. So that includes many of you on this call, and it's applying the best knowledge to apply to achieve this. And really looking forward to working with many Indian partners on this as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Howlett. Thanks for highlighting the salient points of this initiative that has been launched and how it might help the developing countries in particular and the vulnerable countries across the world. This is really a good initiative. Of course, considering the wide range of views that we have received today on the panel, there are different ways in which people will look at this. Professor Colleen Vogel was talking about regenerative solutions. We need to go back to the nature and connect once more and change our development strategy itself. So there are different ways of looking at it. There are some who feel that it's not, and Dr. Schiffer has also endorsed this, that it is not the lack of knowledge and it's not just the data that is required. The problem is what to do with that data and how can we empower the communities to augment their actions further. So, and they know best. In fact, they know best. Traditionally, they have done well, although their capacities are limited, so they have suffered. But today, when the entire world is conscious of the perils or the impending challenges of climate change, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to empower these communities, provide them with resources to be able to, deal with these challenges in a much more effective manner. But that is the kind of global action that is required, and then certainly recognition of the local actions is important. Measurement is important, as Dr. Schiffer has pointed out. We need to catalog these actions, but at the same time, we need to look at it from a global perspective as well. The developmental priorities and the models must change. And that is where the global adaptation framework must move forward. It's not just the collection of data, not just the collection of preparing a catalog of actions by the non-state actors and different levels of governance systems, but how we can augment the capacities of these communities and the elements in the governance to be able to deal with their local challenges in a better way. Finance naturally comes to the fore here. It occupies the central position. We will need to innovate here because the entire model of development, which is based on which we have accepted, decarbonization is of course the priority for all societies across the world. But as Dr. Hale was pointing out, the private sector often talks about the transitional risks of decarbonization more than the physical risks. So we need to balance, integrate these different perspectives where the physical risks are as equally important as the transitional risks in decarbonization. And that's where the global developmental strategies, global adaptation framework must come forward and encourage everyone, every single actor in the governance system across the globe and within the federal structure of different countries. So once again, with these thoughts, let me conclude here and thank all the panelists once again. I am not sure if there are any, is there any time left for any questions? Manish, over to you. If we are, we will receive guidance from you on this question if we need to conclude or we can move forward. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the panelists once again.
Mr. Ashmi and all the panelists, we haven't received any questions from the audience, but I do see that in the chat box there is a very excellent discussion going on between the panelists. So although we have about 7-8 minutes left, we could perhaps overshoot a little bit of time for a quick round of reactions from all the panelists, if you allow, Mr. Rashmi.
Yeah, sure. I think that sounds very well. If I have about 8 minutes, I would like to go back to the panelists and then request once again for their two-liners, or one-liners if they prefer, as to how they look at the whole issue of global governance on adaptation and how it can support the local actions. Let me begin with Dr. Hale first.
Thank you. I think my one line would be on a demand-led approach. So a lot of the campaigns in the global climate action space have been about supply and mobilization. But if you look at the formal process, one of the, I think, positive elements on the adaptation side in recent years has been the development of national adaptation plans, which can then be, which are nationally driven processes to define what countries' adaptation needs are and seek support from the international community to help meet those ambitions. We imagine something similar through the climate action space, where individual communities would come up with their own adaptation plans, which could then be brought into the Marrakech Partnership and these other channels to receive support from knowledge, from resources, from capacity building from these global networks. So I think complementing the output side, supply and mobilization goals with the kind of demand-led process would be, I think, a really interesting thing to explore further.
So thank you. Demand-led approach is the best solution. Thank you very much. Dr. Schäfer.
Thank you very much. I just want to bring forward that I believe some of the earlier research that we've seen from Sander, from Kebe, from India, those kinds of surveys, other ways of data collection. I think here also I'm not sure if the panelists are still online, but also there it could be very interesting to hear some of the perspectives on access to resources, for example, for the Kenyan small and middle-sized enterprises, Indian states, and so on. I'm just curious to hear from them if there's still time.
Okay. The one of the panelists in the earlier session, Dr. Kennedy Mbawe, was speaking on this. Is he still available? Can we request him to, give his thoughts on this issue of access to resources?
Kennedy had to leave for another meeting.
Oh,
so
okay.
But I can speak on behalf of the Climate South project that
yes.
the database that we have from both India and Kenya does indicate that at the non-state or subnational level, the international networks and partnerships come with some sort of financial either advice or concrete financial support. They do play an important role in sustaining, building technical as well as institutional capacities at the level of subnational governments, and to some extent in case of SMEs, although that is a slightly the data is slightly thin on that, but it provides very useful insights about how, along what lines a formal governance structure should think about the question of resources and finance.
Okay. Dr. Colleen Vogel.
Thank you, and thank you once again for a wonderful discussion. I would just like to sort of leave with saying, we're all in this together. Some have more privileged positions than others. They have special seats at the table, and we need to find ways to have data being informed by everyone's perspectives. And I think that's going to be a hard ask, and representatives of society, and challenging what we're doing. And I just want to commend the CAS for enabling the youth to actually come to the table and really taking youth seriously so that they're not just treated as victims. And for me, that's going to be an area where I will be definitely wanting to engage further and enable those voices to be brought forward. But I just want to have one quick more input, and that is we need to also just be critical about what we're doing, I think, a little bit more, perhaps. I think we are already doing that, but a lot of vulnerability assessments, the voices of the vulnerable aren't even in the framing of that. Again, it's in some cases a lot of tick boxes, and we need to be careful because I think we could end up doing quite a lot of maladaptation. And so please don't get me wrong, I'm not decrying the work of development indicators, etc. But I think just calling for a much more spaces for really interrogating some of our framing and our perspectives, because we all matter in this debate. Thank you so much.
Okay, so the possibility of maladaptation, because the kind of framework that we evolve for measuring development or adaptation. That's an important input. Dr. Howlett, how do you look at this?
Yeah, three words, people and story. Let me explain. It's getting our story right, our narrative right. We heard from your Prime Minister Modi, Johnson, with Secretary General Guterres and others. They're starting to speak our language. We need to speak to the politicians, we need to speak to the people. If we talk about maps and NAPAs and NDCs and adaptation metrics, we lose people very quickly. So it's about the people and the story. If we can, we need all, I love science, but sometimes I'll go on for far too long and I'll lose people. So how can we really translate what we're doing into powerful stories which influence people of agency, but also it's agency at the top and agency at the bottom. Communities have agency to take action, and we need to get their stories heard as well as our stories heard to deliver action. So my three words for people and story.
Good. So thank you very much. So the people and the stories, so involve the stakeholders, involve the vulnerable communities in shaping their own programs and designing the actions. Thank you very much. With this, I think we have come to the end of the session. It has been an extremely rich and productive discussion covering different facets of the governance, global governance and the local governance for adaptation, and how we can augment the capacity and the resources of the communities and the vulnerable communities. We will have to deal with a number of questions which the panelists have highlighted. So with this, once again, I thank the panelists and then hand the mic back to Juhi for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Rashmi. On behalf of the Adaptation Futures Secretariat, I would like to thank the panelists for this extremely rich and informative discussion, and especially their varied perspectives. I'd also like to thank the speakers from the first half of the webinar once again for their informative inputs. We're grateful for this opportunity to have heard from some of the leading experts in the fields of climate change adaptation, especially on the subnational and non-state action arena. I'd also like to thank our audience who participated and listened to us for the last 2 hours from around the globe. And last but not least, I'd like to thank you for the continued support and patronage of our sponsors, which is critical for the success of Adaptation Futures 2020, given the unprecedented state of affairs. The recordings of the webinar and its proceedings, along with the presentations, will be available on our website in due time. Please follow our website and social media platforms for updates regarding the conference, now that the new dates have been announced. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.